Well, hello, Father Daly. So nice to see you. Thanks for navigating Zoom with me.
Okay, let me get rid of this. Got it. Okay, here we are. Okay, well, I'm sort of depending on you. Oh, let me turn those background lights off and see whether that improves. That does that improve my face?
That looks great to me.
Yeah, okay, fine.
Well, hello, Father Daly. So nice to meet you. Thank you for taking this time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, and you can call me Bob if you're comfortable with that.
Awesome. Great to meet you, Bob.
Yeah.
So where are you? Are you zooming from Boston?
From where I am, I'm at a resident now at our Jesuit Health Center in Western Massachusetts. It's about a half hour's drive from the west of the center of Boston.
Okay. And how
It
far are you
used-
from? I'm
But
sorry.
it used to be the Philosophate in Theology, where I did my basic philosophy theology studies,
Hmm.
3 philosophy, 4 theology. So it's a very familiar place to me. That's where I'm spending presumably the final years of my life.
So when was the last time you were there?
Where?
Where you are now? You said it's where you did
The
your
last
original
time?
studies?
Oh, well, I did my philosophy studies there in 1954 to 57. And then from 60 to 64, my basic theology before going to Europe for my doctorate.
Wow.
And so in between, well, over the last, say, 15 or 20 years, I would normally come here to make my annual retreat. So the place is, it's home to me. Yeah. Some of my classmates did not have a happy time going through formation. And so they came here in their final days only unwillingly. But I didn't have that problem. I was happy while I was here and was happy to come back here when it was time for me to move from an active position.
Awesome. So you're not far from Boston now, and you taught at Boston College for many years. Are you still teaching there?
No, I left there a little bit more than 2 years ago. I retired from full-time teaching in 2002. And from 2002 until 2020, I continued to live there as a retired but active scholar.
Wonderful. And you're originally from the Boston area as well,
I'm
correct?
originally from West Quincy, which was less than a 1 hour's bus ride into Boston for Boston College High School. So I graduated from Boston College High School in 1950 at age 17, and that's when I entered the Jesuits. They were accepting children in those days.
Yeah. What do you think now what is the earliest they can be accepted now?
Well, you could still be accepted right after high school,
Oh, really?
but the average age of those coming in is now in mid-20s.
Hmm.
It's become customary for people to finish college education and maybe even have begun professional life before joining the Jesuits. So the average entering age now is somewhere in the early to mid-20s. It was quite different in my time. Most of us were entering right from high school or after a few years of college. We used to refer to someone who had graduated from college as an older man. And once we had someone join us who was 28 years old and he wasn't an older man, we referred to him simply as an old man.
Well, since we're on your biography, you join the Jesuits, you do your initial studies, and then you alluded to going to Europe. What did
That's
that
right.
entail?
Well, the basic training for a Jesuit is after the preliminary and bachelor's education was to get a licentiate, that's an equivalent to a master's degree in philosophy. And then, and that got finished in 1950, from 54 to 57, right here at Western when I did that. And then for the next 2 years, I taught, they called it Regency. Between philosophy and theology was customary for Jesuits in formation, in between philosophy and then starting theology, to teach for a few years or do special studies. So for 2 years, I taught Latin and English and religion at Cheverus Classical High School, a Jesuit high school in Portland, Maine. And while I was there, I also actually coached football and track, and did all sorts of other things as well as teaching. Would have been happy to continue that life, but then for my third year of Regency, before coming back to theology, I was sent off to do a master's degree in English literature in Washington, D.C. at Catholic University of America. In those days, I was expecting to specialize in English literature studies. And then in 1960, having done that, specializing in medieval Latin, medieval English, and what. But anyway, it was a very successful time, and then came back and started out my basic theology for 4 years here at Western. It was a time when we were still teaching in the old system of basically memorizing theses and what have you. And for some people, that stunted intellectual development, because you could get by memorizing the theses without having to understand, without really understanding them much. But fortunately, in my work in English literature had already introduced me to literary theory, and while the year and 2 summers at Catholic University doing that English degree, I also did a minor in medieval Latin studies with Martin R.P. Maguire, who was the general editor of the 2nd edition of the New Catholic Encyclopedia. And he was a scholar to the tips of his fingers. And I learned a lot about scholarly method from him. And he recognized right away that I was capable of learning things. So he would lend me, he would assign me a research task for writing papers and stuff that required me to go to the Library of Congress and use that. And he would give me his Library of Congress card to go down to the Library of Congress, because the Catholic University was at the northern edge of the District of Columbia. So I'd take the bus into, but anyway, so when I came back to Western to do my theology from 1960 to 64, I already knew what good theological method, what good method, scholarly method and research items was the faculty wasn't paying much attention to that. They were still, most of them, in that old mode. Fortunately, I had various things that protected me from the deleterious effects of that. So I had a happy 4 years. But I noticed that many of my fellow students weren't protected from it. And so when it came time from them to, at the end of their lives, to need the care, end of life care, would come here, because this place had morphed into the health center. It was no longer the place where we came for our studies. So for some of them, it was and continues to be an unhappy move when they have to come here to a place where they suffered as students. Whereas for me, I wasn't suffering. What happened was that in the course of theology, despite getting singularly unimpressive grades in the central courses, they kept asking me if I wanted to switch to theology. And I didn't take them seriously because I wasn't getting impressive grades, and the people who went on to specialize in philosophy and theology were the ones who were getting top grades. So, but after repeated requests, I realized they were serious. So once I started giving it serious thought, I realized I could be happy in my life specializing in theology just as easily as I could if I was specializing in English literature. So I switched then to English literature. And we had already, since I was planning to do doctoral level work on Renaissance English literature, which meant, of course, doing comparative work with the Provençal literature and Italian literature and French literature, as well as English. So to help me with that, it was decided that I would do my final year of Jesuit training, which is a spiritual year, and usually added on after having finished your formal studies. And so I did that in Florence, Italy, because I was already planning, that's where I would have gone to do that year, and doing it in Italy would help me, pick up Italian that I would need for my, so anyway, that's, so that was one of there were various changes, really changes in my academic life. That was maybe the first really significant one, switching from English literature to theology. And then and then I was allowed, by way of exception, things were opening up at that time, to do my doctoral level studies. We all used to do it as in a 2-year program called a biennium at the Gregorian University, in Rome, and was mostly a sort of an upgraded level of the memorized theses sort of thing. And but I was allowed to find another place, and just before coming to Europe to do that year in Florence, Italy, I wrote to 22 Catholic faculties in Europe, in Italy, France, Germany, Netherlands, England, France. And to my astonishment, by the end of the summer, all 22 had answered. And I had offers to come and do my doctoral work in all of them. And although in some of them, I wouldn't have been able to do the doctoral work because they were North German Reformed, and doing doctoral work required membership in the church and the profession of faith in that particular evangelical church. So they said you could be welcome to come as a scholar, but you probably wouldn't want to get into the degree program because of that requirement. But Oskar Kuhlmann in Basel and Rudolf Schnackenburg in Würzburg and Johannes Betz in Mainz. And I chose were the most interesting positive answers. And I chose Betz because in theology, one of the few Jesuits teachers there who was not a slave to that memorized the thesis thing, Father Ed Kilmartin. I'm not sure whether you've ever heard of his name, but
what was the first name? I heard Martin, I'm sorry.
Edward Kilmartin. 30 or 40 years ago, he was recognized as one of the 2 or 3 or 4 leading Catholic scholars on the issue of the Eucharist and sacraments. But he had already introduced me to the work of Johannes Betz, which was to do systematic theology or doctrinal theology, but very rigorously from its biblical and patristic early church background. And so having been anyway, that's why I chose to go and do my studies, with him. And while there in Mainz, after 3 semesters, he moved to Würzburg which
Hmm.
is also where Rudolf Snarkenborg was. And Rudolf Snarkenborg was at the time the leading European Catholic scholar in New Testament. He had a doctoral seminar with about 25 people in it. And by quirk of good luck, without going into today's, I managed to get to meet him. And he allowed me to be an active participant in his New Testament doctoral seminar while doing my doctorate in systematic theology with Johannes Bett. So I was in effect active in two doctoral seminars, one in New Testament and the other in my own field in doctrinal theology, based on biblical and patristic background. And things went on from there. Then came back to Boston College in 1971 and was there for a total of 49 and a half years, including the time that I was there as a retired scholar. Did a lot of teaching, but not as much as most people would at that time, because for 15 of those years, I was the chair of the theology department, which was a very large department and growing and developing at that time. And so the administrative work meant I couldn't teach as much as I normally would. But anyway, in the course of, say, 6 or 7 years of my teaching, I almost by accident discovered that the liturgical scholars were the ones interested in my work on sacrifice. It wasn't the systematic theologians, but rather the liturgical scholars. And they invited me to come to their annual meeting, the meeting of the North American Academy of Liturgy, to talk to them about sacrifice. And so I did, and discovered, well, these are the people who are, Catholics and Protestants, both, all of them interested in my work and wanting to talk about it. And so I said, well, I guess I'll have to join them. And so I became a liturgical scholar, at least specializing in the Eucharist and using my research that I already was well into in sacrifice at that time, because that happened by the time, more or less about the time that my first two books on sacrifice were being published. And so anyway, that's basically how my academic life went. It was, I saw a lot of the world because I was a member of 4 or 5 different academic groups, 2 of them liturgical, one of them ecumenical, another just Jesuit ecumenical, and then the Renee Gerard group as well. And they would meet, at different places around the world. So I got to see much of the world just simply by attending the conferences that there's only a couple of them were just North American. Most of them were international because of either being Jesuit or whatever. But anyway, that's sort of a quick rundown of my life.
I appreciate that overview. And I'm glad you mentioned your work on sacrifice, because I think that was probably the first thing that really attracted me to reaching out to you. A couple years ago, did an independent study, just one summer, read through a bunch of Gerard's work, Renee Gerard's work. And as you could imagine, doing that on your own, I became quite confused. So
yeah.
So I've been sort of poking around ever since, and it got me to talking to a bunch of colleagues of mine and then a bunch of biblical scholars. And when I was looking into that, I saw that you were an expert on sacrifice. So I reached out to you. I'm interested if there's a genesis before we move maybe to Gerard at some point. I'm interested if there's a genesis to your interest in sacrifice specifically.
Well, it was providentially accidental. At the beginning of my doctoral studies, this would have been in the fall of 1960, 1965, in the fall of 1965, beginning my doctoral studies in minds, I thought I was, and I thought that I had an agreement with my doctoral director, Johannes Betz, to be working towards studying what happened to the theology of suffering, the theology and spirituality of suffering between St. Paul, where it was considerably developed in his letters, and the Golden Age theologians of the fourth and fifth centuries. In between, there didn't seem to be much development of that theme. And after a couple of months of basic work, of general background work in that area to prepare me for that, in conversation with my director, Johannes Betz, I discovered that he thought I was working on sacrifice, and specifically, and that meant that I would have to pay careful attention to Origen of Alexandria as a central figure, and he was all enthusiastic about that. First, I didn't say anything when I was thinking to myself, first, my father was in politics, and I learned to have a political sense about how to deal with, sudden things like this. And so thinking about it, says, well, all my preparatory work would be just as good for studying the origins of the development of sacrifice, of the development of the origins of the theology of sacrifice. So I said, well, I could be just as happy doing that as this my own, what I thought I was doing on the theology of suffering. So I said, okay, that's what I'll be doing. So that's how that, literally, it was that accidental. And so that worked out very, very nicely. In the course of the first 2 years of my doctoral studies, I wasn't required to do much coursework, so I was attending, I was sitting in on professors' courses so that we'd be familiar with each other when it came time for the examination. After 2 years of preliminary work of gathering the texts of Origen, where Origen did speak about sacrifice quite a bit, and also gathering what I could about the secondary literature on the theme of the sacrifice in the New Testament, in the Bible, and in the early church. I was ready, says, well, this should prepare me now to start working up a thesis. And but I realized that by that time, see, part of my background had been, while I was here in theology, 1960 to 64, I was a member of the team, mostly of fellow students, but led by the faculty, of course, of the book, the periodical New Testament Abstracts. And so I worked closely with that for most of the 4 years that I was here, doing my basic theology. And for a while, I was basically in charge of the section called Books and Opinions. That is, the professor in charge, who was the editor, would identify the 40 or 45 most important book reviews that had appeared in New Testament studies. And my job was to get a 200-word abstract that summarized, a 100 to 200-word abstract, summarizing that book review. And I found out that, and not many people were able to do that. I ended up writing most of them myself, but I'd learned in the course of doing that, I got a real sense of what New Testament studies was. And so that when it came time for my director to move from Mainz to Würzburg, where Rudolf Schnackenburg also was, who was the leading scholar in New Testament studies. That's what gave me my entry, to him, and enabled me to specialize at the doctoral level and the doctoral seminar level, both in New Testament and in systematic theology, in my theology of sacrifice. So that's how that providentially, came together and worked nicely. So after my switch to liturgical studies, it was only sort of accidental too that I got introduced to Renee Gerard while I was from 1977, 78. That was my first sabbatical year. And I spent that at St. Georgen, which is a philosophy theology seminar for Jesuits and for diocesan priests as well, a rather sizable thing. And it was an excellent faculty with a superb library, and so I it became over the years my second home. My 4 or 5 sabbatical years over the course of my active life, they were all spent at Frankfurt in St. Georgen, so that I had become, German had become a second language for me, almost like a mother tongue. I could function happily in it, but there, Norbert Lofink was an Old Testament scholar, and he told me about this work, Do We Need Scapegoats, by Raimund Schwager. And it was Raimund Schwager was a Swiss, well, he was a Jesuit. I think he was probably Swiss, native Swiss, but teaching at Innsbruck. And basically, it was intended to be an introduction to Raimund Schwager, using the New Testament, basically, or the Bible as the basis. And so it ended up, well, what happened was I was asked to vet the English translation of that, done by Maria Assad, who's an American scholar, who was an excellent translator, but wasn't a theologian. And so she was translating this basically, theoretical, theological work. And it was kind of a mess because she didn't know that, some of the terms she was using were specific theological terms with a history of meaning. And you couldn't treat them as you would, a literary source. You had to use those words only in those meanings, or otherwise it would be confusing to the readers. It would have been so the book would have been a disaster if it got published that way, because it would have turned off scholars. It would have been a confusing mess. So I went through it very, very carefully, and when she got her manuscript back from me and found out that every page was filled with corrections, she said she was aghast. And but then she looked carefully, and I explained to her what was going on, and she says, "Oh, yeah, okay. You can't use this word, and then use it synonyms, for variety, because those synonyms have a different meaning theologically." And so in the course of doing that close work, that's what introduced me to the work of Renee Gerard. And from then on, I then became a member of that from it was fairly early that the group, the Renee Gerard group, the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, had just recently been organized and was meeting every year, and I became a regular participant of that. And that's how I got introduced into Renee Gerard, sort of just, as so many earlier developments in my academic life, sort of, by accident, it just happened. And I recognized right away how important Gerard was. Yeah.
You said the Do We Need Scapegoats? It was by a Swiss Jesuit. What was that name again?
Raimund Schwager, Schwager. Do We Need Scapegoats? It's still one of the best introductions to mimetic theory. Yeah.
Okay. And remind me what year that was.
Oh, okay. This would have been in the 1970s.
Okay. Well, I don't know if it's super important that I know the date, but I'm curious what Gerard had written at that point.
Well, okay. What he had written at that point was his basic fundamental work.
Was it the Violence and the Sacred? Is that the first one?
Yeah, Violence et le Sacré.
Yeah.
Violence and the Sacred. Okay. And that had not yet been translated, but Raimund Schwager had read that, and he realized how important that was for theology. Schwager himself, Gerard himself was not a theologian. He wasn't, or pretending to be. But he immediately contacted Gerard, and they hit it off right away. I'm not sure what language they spoke in. It might well have been French, because he was Schwager himself was Swiss. But in any case, yes, I'm sure it would have been French. But anyway, they hit it off. They became close friends and colleagues. So what was happening there was that from fairly early on, from the 1970s onwards, Gerard was in contact with theologians and with the theological significance of his work, because he began by having, he developed his original idea of sacrifice from his literary works and studies, and it wasn't theological. And so it was in terms of Christian sensitivities, it was a totally negative. It was only the bad aspects of sacrifice, the negative aspects of sacrifice that he thought sacrifice was. But he learned from Schwager and from his correspondence and working with Schwager that there were positive meanings of that positive Christian meanings, as well as positive Jewish meanings that were very important. And so if you will, the theological significance of Raimund Schwager, of Renee Gerard, was due largely, and that it worked out successfully, largely to this friendship and arrangement that he had with, that Gerard had with Raimund Schwager.
Interesting.
Yeah. So go ahead.
So you, in some ways, helped translate that introduction. Do we need scapegoats?
That's right. Do we need scapegoats? I translated, so the Do We Need Scapegoats is the English title of that thing, and so it's a good translation, because Maria was an excellent translator, and once she saw what I was doing, she was that theology had words and concepts that were basically set And if you were going to translate something into English, you had to be aware of what those were. And so, anyway, so that's really how that started. Yeah.
So it starts there, and at some point, I know you became really enthusiastic, so enthusiastic about his ideas that you joined, as you said, the colloquium of, I think, violence and
Colloquium on violence and religion. Yes. And
what does the interim look like? Did you start reading Gerard at that point? Does he intersect with what you were writing and reading at that point? What does the interim look like?
I did some reading of Gerard, but basically a lot, not a huge amount, but because the the introduction to Gerardian theory that that Schwager did in that book was very sound, very solid. And then once I joined that group, their basic operating language was English, and there were some early scholars like Andrew McKenna and Hamilton Kelly. There was a whole group of North American, later Australian, English-speaking scholars who did a lot of writing and speaking. So I never became, an expert in Gerard's writing itself, but I recognized that his insights into the origins and development, of sacrifice were key. Interestingly, the most an impressive number of what I would call the most gifted, theoretically gifted scholars, theological scholars on the issue of sacraments had a great respect and reverence for Renee Gerard. It was so what was going on? So now Gerard himself, when he finished Violon sur le Sacré in the early 1970s, he already had a sense that what he was discovering was a biblical Christian Jewish understanding of sacrifice, and that it had a positive meaning as well as a negative meaning. It wasn't something that was just all bad and had to be transcended and got totally beyond. For example, one of the facts, for example, that struck me right away, and that these theologians themselves recognized, is that we had not developed a theory of sacrifice that explains its positive aspects. And why does that need to be explained? Well, people generally recognize that the fundamental message of the New Testament, the fundamental message of Jesus, is nonviolent, and yet violence runs through the entire Bible in all sorts of ways, and is not absent, even from and the language, at least the language of violence, is used by New Testament people and Christians to express their spiritual understanding. They're nonviolent. So what's going on there? No one could explain that. The Old Testament theology, the New Testament theologies, as well as allegory and the spiritual meaning and what have you. But to take seriously the fact that violence runs through the thing, that Gerard's general theory provided a method and a matrix, a way of making sense of all of this, and to come up with a positive theory, and not one that you have to explain by a spiritualizing meaning or an allegorical meaning, and etc. So that's what struck me right from the outset, that with the help of Renee Gerard, we've now been able to express a theology of sacrifice that is positive. I mean that, well, if you've read any of my works, you've got a sense of what I've been trying to do with that. Yeah, but that's basically how that came about. The almost accidental getting acquainted with Renee Gerard, and recognizing right away with the help of Raimund Schwager how important this could be for theology. And in my own book, Sacrifice Unveiled, towards the end of that book, I have a full chapter on using Gerardian mimetic theory as a matrix for understanding what we mean by Christian sacrifice.
One of the things that struck me when I was reading Gerard was, as you alluded to, sort of this, how he starts with this anthropological theory of sacrifice.
That's right.
And then how it leads to this theological interpretation as he applies it to the Old and New Testament.
What was actually happening to him, he was, despite himself, he grew up, traditionally, culturally Catholic, but like many typical French intellectuals, had become, religious and what have you. What was happening, he was discovering religion. He was discovering Christianity and its Jewish background, and by the time he had finished writing Violence et le Sacré, he, in the early 1970s, that had already been taking place in his mind, and that's when providentially he became in contact with Raimund Schwager, and so that he was the next major work that he published was the big thing, the Choses Cachées depuis la fondation du monde, things hidden from the beginning. Okay, that was actually,
I think the English title is things hidden since the foundation of time.
That's
or
right.
The foundation of the world, maybe.
That's right. That was that he wrote that in French. That stunned the intellectual world, because that's when he laid out that his sense of things was Christian. So he had then, in the course of that time, had been, well, he wasn't, he was it was kind of a conversion experience. He discovered that he was a Catholic Christian, and then became a piously practicing Catholic, for the rest of his life. That stunned the intellectual world, because his first book, Violence et le Sacré, was explaining things from anthropological and literary background, not using religion in a positive way. Whereas by the time he had written that and published that, he had been realizing that what he had been discovering was the positive meanings.
And I think now that I remember, or I'm remembering now, that I think he had an earlier book called Deceit, Desire in the Novel.
Correct.
And that was all about, I forget exactly, it wasn't originally called that in France. I forget what it was called originally.
Mensonge, wait a minute. But it studied Victor Hugo, the French novelist, also the
Don Quixote.
Don Quixote. and Tolstoy.
Yeah, and I remember you're right to point out that that book was entirely literary. Then he becomes anthropological in his scope, and then he becomes, even when he's anthropological, he's capital R religious insofar as he's thinking about sort of ancient religious practices and ancient religious sacrifices. But then he becomes explicitly Christian, at least in his theology, in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World.
Now, he never became a theologian as such, but recognized that his work was integral to what theologians were developing. And early on, there's an English Jesuit named Carwin who wrote a couple of books introducing, recently over the last few decades, introducing, but Cowan points out one of the things that's characteristic of René Girard is that he's resolutely interdisciplinary, that he's not held to, and sometimes seems not to respect, the boundaries between the different disciplines. And that has enabled some scholars to turn him off, because they could point out that, well, he's really not with it within such and such and such and such, and what was really going on, that he's recognizing the the interrelationships between disciplines that that are necessary to, because any really human problem or issue is by its nature interdisciplinary, because we are psychological and sociological and historical and literary and what, because we are all, because the human being is, you can't explain a human being adequately from just one discipline, just from psychology, or just from literature, or just from sociology, or just from educational theory, but all of these together. So his willingness to sometimes cavalierly move across disciplinary boundaries has annoyed and turned off some people.
I heard him say in an interview once something along the lines of everyone likes to talk a big interdisciplinary game, but that he actually tries to do that.
Yes.
I was saying earlier that what struck me at the beginning was how anthropological he was, and I was sort of, as I was reading Violence in the Sacred, was really blown away by the scope with which he could get me to consider the pervasiveness of violence and sacrifice, and what becomes his sort of mimetic theory.
That's right.
But what I'm curious about from a religious and a theological perspective is, for personally, one of the things that interested me in reading through Gerard's works was it re-engaged me with a lot of the Christian symbolism, and it made me realize, at least in Gerard's argument and my interpretation of it, that a lot of the Christian symbols have this deep anthropological, even the biblical story itself seems to have this deep anthropological base.
Of course.
Right. And I remember it dawning on me, like, wow, like, it almost re-engaged me. Not that I had a conversion experience like Gerard, but it certainly re-engaged me with many aspects of my sort of culturally Catholic upbringing. But sometimes I wonder, it helps that Gerard himself became very Catholic, but I wonder sometimes if that sort of anthropological base or foundation applied to the symbolism of Christianity sometimes troubles the literal interpretations of of Christian sacraments. So, for example, I went to a mass with my father. My dad and I went to a mass, and it was the Mass of Corpus Christi, so the body of Christ. And the deacon gets up there, and at least in my experience, I'm not, I'm far from the most devout Catholic. I've heard this homily before, some version of it, where I'm reminded that the Eucharist is the actual body of Christ.
Yes.
And I remember thinking, as I was reading Gerard, it seems like that concept, the Eucharist, seems rife with possibility for being symbolic to, this sort of sacrificial deliverance from a mimetic theory, if that makes sense. And yet I wonder if that butts up against a more literal interpretation, like this is the actual body of Christ. Because my problem sometimes with that is, if you're going to tell a group of people that it's actually Jesus, then you also need to either explain why we need to eat him, or you need to explain that there's a deep anthropological history to this symbol, and therefore it's a symbol and not actually literal. And I'm sorry if that sounds heretical, but I found myself thinking that as I was reading Gerard. I'm curious what you think.
No, you're right in the sense of the complexity of this, and and we don't have theologians have not developed a unified consensual explanation for the mystery of the Eucharist. If you're Aristotelian, and you can go, then the distinction between the substance and the accidents, can help you to explain it. So, however, most people are not Aristotelian in that sense anymore. If you're platonically minded and what have you, then you can see that, well, the spiritual meaning of it. So, I mean, our theology of the Eucharist then say, yes, this is the body of Christ. But the is not what is not what a scientist, a chemist, or a biologist would see in examining the host. So, well, how then do you explain it? They said, well, if you're Aristotelian Thomist, you've got that easy explanation, but most people these days are not that. Well, how do you explain it? There are many Christians. Most Christians, if you ask them to explain their understanding of the Eucharist, almost all of them would come up with something that an informed theologian would recognize is simply off base. It doesn't work, it's not, and that's because, well, it's like the explanation of religious truth, that the deeper you try to get into the truth, the less you're able to understand it. And that's as simple as the relationship between the loving providence and knowledge of God, and God's, if you will, control, if you will, the power of God. Okay, fine, all of that, and human free will. Now, early on, Origen of Alexandria and most of the really good theologians have recognized that you're up against something that we're not able to explain satisfactorily. really explain satisfactorily how it can be that we have total free will and God respects that free will, and yet God is all powerful and all knowing. God knows ahead of time what we're thinking because God. So it's similar to trying to explain what do we mean by the saying that the Eucharist is the body of Christ. How do we explain that? As I said, well, when people were more or less dealing with a scholastic Aristotelian-based understanding, you could come up with an explanation that brought you closer to the mystery. But you would always get to the point where you can't explain any further. Yeah. And one of the interesting things is that theologian, or Thomas himself, in the prologue to his commentary on the fourth book of the Sentences, anyway, he mentions that theology at its deepest, the deeper it gets, the more symbolic and image dependent it gets. That the literal understanding, it's not the physical body of Christ, none of the accidents, of flesh, blood, space, time, and what have you, apply to it. No, so, and well, and anyway, when you stop to think of it, there are practical religious truths, the theoretical religious truths. There are creedal statements, but on basically any one of them, when you push it to try to get an ultimate explanation, you get to the point where you can't. You just boom, you're up against them. So that in a certain sense, the rational atheist is correct. You can't explain God. You can't give an ultimately satisfactory full explanation of Christian faith or of religious faith. And at the same time, your practical wisdom tells you, yet you can't live without that faith. So,
When I was starting to begin to wrestle with this problem of reading Gerard and then going to church, and you could imagine, you're coming off of a chapter of Gerard or maybe even a whole book, and suddenly you're looking at all the symbols in the church and you're thinking, wow, isn't this fascinating? He's sort of the Lamb of God, and the Lamb of God is sort of sacrificed on behalf, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm thinking about it, and it made me go back to certain parts of Gerard, like I really enjoyed, not necessarily his ancient interpretations, but his mythological interpretations, especially his consideration of the comparison between Jesus and somebody like Dionysus, and the sort of Greek tradition of sacrifice, where you have Dionysus realizes that he's the necessary sacrifice, but that sacrifices should continue. And while Jesus realizes, quite dramatically in the garden, that he's a necessary sacrifice, but that he's to be the last sacrifice that stops all sacrifices, or that forces people to, obviously we've had sacrifices since then, and scapegoats, etc. But he was to start to turn us sort of inward on ourselves to realize how dependent on sacrifice we are. Can you?
Yeah, that sort of makes, you have to, when you speak that way too, you have to remember, did Jesus ever Yes, he did use sacrificial language. That's the fascinating thing, that the early Christians used the language of ritual material sacrifice to explain, as the language for explaining their Christian understanding of sacrifice. That's part, well, in a sense they had to, because what else could they have done? I mean,
Well, I was going to ask you, how much of that do you think, and by that I mean them using the early Christians or the authors of the Gospels, even Paul and whoever else might have contributed to some of Paul's letters, how much of that do you think was the result of Paul's expansion into Greek territory,
oh, some of it definitely.
where they had a rich history of sacrifice in relation to Dionysus?
Yeah, I mean, there was a richly developed language and conceptuality of logical material sacrifice. For example, just the language of Epistle to the Romans, chapter 12, right from the beginning of the chapter. I exhort you, brothers, to offer your bodies as a spiritual sacrifice. Well, he's using the language of logike tousia, which was logical, meaning logike, meaning, well, logical, spiritual, but he's using it Greek religious philosophy had already figured out that that material sacrifice is worthless and it's meaningless. You know, the only sacrifice that's important, that's helpful, is rational, is ultimately ethical and what have you. But they still use the language, you know. So Paul is aware of and uses the language of material sacrifice to try to express the spiritual meaning of Christian sacrifice. So that the phrase logike tousia, meaning literally logical, rational sacrifice, can often get translated in the Christian sense to pneumatike, meaning spiritual, referring to not just to the Holy Spirit, but referring to the basic understanding of the basic material of what a human being is: body, soul, spirit, and so that's one of the one. It's not a paradox. It's just simply the way things are. We have no language. Human beings don't have a language that is capable of doing justice to the mysteries we're trying to explain and trying to live. And you know, for example, the way conversion often happens is an indication of that. It's usually, if you're being converted from atheism or from non-religion to religion or what, it's usually, or characteristically, the converting point is not a rational or a theological explanation, but the example of Christian life that you see. And they say if that's what these people live by and are willing to die by, there's got to be something to that. And so that the practical, the experience, the experience of being Christian, or the experience of someone being Christian, is what is usually the basis for an actual conversion. The intellectual discovery of it that some people do go through, like Renee Gerard did go through an intellectual route to discovering, but what he was discovering was was already in his blood, in his feelings, that that he didn't have to invent, what he was discovering. He said, "That's what my mother was teaching me."
Did you ever get a chance to meet Renee Gerard? I
Oh yes.
asked. Oh, you did?
Yes. Oh yes.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes.
What was it? Can you tell me what that was like? If you still have time, I'm sorry if I'm over.
Well, gentle, friendly, open-minded. I mean, he really was. He really was a humble man. He had an intellectual pride, as you can recognize, but personally, he was open and friendly and what have you, and not because I do remember one lecture. It was towards the end of his life. Well, not all that, but he's still quite active. It was, I believe, a meeting that we were having in Innsbruck that he got up and started to give his lecture, and he was talking French. And his wife, Martha, was sitting beside one of the organizers and says, "You'll have to go up and tell him that he's talking in French." So he didn't go up there and he said, "Oh." She says, "Oh, excuse me," and suddenly just slipped into English, but not at all embarrassed or what have you, or flustered or what. And know that, I mean, that's quite a gaffe not to realize what language you're speaking in and what have you. But it was. He said, "Oh, so excuse me." It was yes. He was and it was interesting. He respected. He knew I was a theologian, what have you, and I remember at one of our meetings, might have been a meeting in the Netherlands and what have you. It was at the time when the Sunday at which the meeting ended. It usually the meeting would go, Thursday to Sunday morning, and Sunday morning would just be gathering to disband, to disperse. So we were having a final mass on Sunday morning. There were about maybe 20 or 30 of us there, and I had noticed ahead of time. I was coming from vacation where I had plenty of time, where I would usually make my retreat, and I noticed that the reading, the gospel reading for that passage Sunday included the passage that says, "I see Satan fall like lightning from the sky." And it's, oh, this, that someone's coming. It's probably someone with my supper, but that's all right. They'll just put it on the table and not bother us anymore. So I had carefully written out a sermon that basically explained what people there at the Mass said. Well, that's what this is all about. But the heart of the sermon was an illustration of talking. So there was this man who So I said a few things in the beginning that, sort of laid out, alluded to or mentioned or pointed to the basic meaning of mimetic theory. And then told a little story of a young man who was brilliant, successful, whatever, and whatever, and I went on to describe what it was like that, was so brilliant and successful that he was able to use people, for his ends, and that's what people were for, was for him, to be of use to him, and that he had a girlfriend that everyone thought that they were a perfect match and what have you, and he realized that he began to realize that she really loved him and she would die for him, and apparently there was no real affection there too, but he was also smart. He says, he realized he was being called to respond to that and not use her, for as long as it was helpful to him, and then, when no longer could be used to help him, just move on to somebody else or something else and whatever. But he said, he says, because he was smart and had been touched by her, he realized he had to respond. He said, but he knew that if he did that, he would no longer be in control. He would be opening himself to become a victim. If he responded to that love with love, he would literally, he knew he would be exposing himself to become a victim, to be something that could be sacrificed, and what have you. And I said, and I didn't do it further. He says, people all over the world, in different cultures and different religions, end up often faced with that decision, whether they are going to respond to love with genuine, authentic love and allow themselves to become victims. He says, and when they say yes, that's when Satan falls like lightning from the sky. And so basically, I developed that and what. So I stopped and invited someone to say a word or what have you. And after a brief pause, a young man stood up and said, "You've just told the story of my life."
You told that story?
I told that story. And then he's, as the end of the homily. And that's how the homily ended. It says, and when people all over the world, no matter what religion, what have you, say yes to that.
It resonated with me. What a fantastic story.
Yeah.
Had Renee Gerard, I almost want to end it there because it was
poetic. I had sent a copy of that to Gerard.
And he wrote a book.
I had it with that.
He wrote a book called I See Satan Fall Like Lightning.
That's right. That's why I chose that that's why I chose to insisted that I give the homily that morning, because I was on vacation. I had time to carefully write out, very, very carefully write out the homily. So it was quite effective. I'm a gifted writer and speaker if you give me a little bit of time to prepare something. And I showed it to, who was it? The guy who wrote Sacrifice. Anyway, a Gerardian scholar, quite.
Was it
and long-term
Dumont?
also a friend. And he was in email contact with Gerard, who wasn't at that particular meeting. So I gave him a copy of it, and he sent it to Gerard, and Gerard liked it. she said, yes, that's it. And people were saying after the homily, that's what explains what this is all about.
Hmm.
So in that sense, Gerard, no, and personally had been personally familiar with him and what have you, but it was just simply because I was just one of the people who, when you would meet, at those annual meetings, he attended most of the meetings of the Colloquium on Violence and Religion. Why he was not at that one where I gave that homily, I'm not sure. But in any case, his friend had sent him a copy of that. And he said, yes, that's it. He was happy with that.
What a great story. Well,
Yeah.
Bob, Father Daly, I know your dinner's over there, so I'm not going to keep you from that. I can't
Well,
tell you how much I appreciate you taking this time, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Okay. So Kevin, God bless you, and thank you for this conversation too. You came out of the blue and said, oh, okay, we've got to respond to this. So God bless you, Kevin.
Yeah, and I'll be in contact. I'll send you a version of the episode if you happen to be interested in maybe listening back to it. Don't feel no pressure to do that. But if you think of anybody who I might be interested in speaking to, feel free to send those names over via email. I would be happy to look into that.
Sure. Well, the person who was probably, well, the one or two most brilliant theologians, Bob, to use Gerard's material, Robert Doran, D-O-R-I-N, a Jesuit, just died recently, about a month ago. So that's why I have this sort of in mind. But I do remember he was one of those. The interesting thing is Bob Doran was primarily a Lonergan scholar. I don't know whether you have ever heard of Bernard Lonergan. He was one of the great theoreticians, theological theoreticians, that so much so that even secular culture recognized him because he was the cover person of Time magazine once.
No, I'm not familiar.
Yeah, Bernard J.F. Lonergan wrote Insight, a study of human understanding, and Method in Theology. And those were his two main works, and a number of articles, but basically became, one of the theologians that people try to. The University of Toronto recently published a critical edition of his works, 25 volumes. And Bob Doran was the main editor to see that through. And basically, anyway, bless you, Kevin. God bless, and keep in touch.
I will. Enjoy your dinner.
Thank you. God bless. Yep.
Good night.
Now let's see. What do I just have to shut this down? It takes care of itself when I shut it, I guess.
If you hit end, and you know what, I can end it in a second here. So as soon as
that took care of it.
All right.
God bless.
Bye-bye.